Yeah, there's a, oh, that one's live.
Yeah, do you want to,
That one's live
Yeah.
there.
does that attach to like you?
It could, but I think since this one's on, it doesn't look like it. Oh, they've hooked it here.
Yeah.
It's this.
Okay.
So.
And this room is, well, my voice, I'm loud. But if you step over here, if you talk loud, then, if you wanted to walk, it probably would work. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll stick at the podium.
Water, we don't.
That'd be great if
I think we do.
Let me see if we can locate something.
Thanks a lot. Is this your pen?
What's that?
I said I'm just setting my recorder up here.
Oh, gotcha.
I don't have to worry about the audio.
Are you
The Lecture time.
All right, I'd like to welcome all of you to the Sid Easley Lecture, which is sponsored by the History Department at Murray State University. It is great to see such a large crowd here tonight. I see professors and students, and I see people from the community, and I think that's really great. Last year when we gathered here, there was a COVID spike, and we didn't have many people, although Dr. John David Smith from UNC Charlotte, the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, delivered a very interesting talk on the history of reparations for African Americans in the United States. So it's good to see all of you here. This is the 5th Easley Lecture that the History Department has sponsored. Sid Easley was well known to all of you as a pillar at Murray State University and in the Murray community. He was chair of the Board of Regents. He was the first to receive the Golden Horseshoe Award, and he was a strong supporter of the Murray State University History Department. And this is a fitting tribute to Mr. Easley and his family. I'd like to thank Dr. David Balthrop, Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts, for being here tonight. Thanks also go to Dr. Kathy Callahan, our department chair, for her expert leadership of the History Department and for her support of this lecture series each year. From the Office of Development, Kayla Allen Dunn has just done yeoman service in putting this lecture together. She's been a pleasure to work with, and she will oversee the book signing of Dr. Goan's book, on which her talk is based after the lecture. Let's see, I also want to thank Tina Burnott from the Office of Development. She always supports the History Department and helps us with events like this one tonight. And I would be remiss not to thank Tori Herndon, who keeps our department together and does a lot of thankless tasks. We greatly appreciate the work that she has done in the history department and the help in putting this lecture together. So we're very glad that you are here. I think that this is a special night for the history department and for all of us. And now I would like to call Melissa Easley up to the podium, and she will be followed by Dr. Kathy Callahan, who will give out awards to deserving history students. There you go. You got it. There you go.
Greetings from the family of Sid Easley. I think I'm about the last Easley in Kentucky, but I can prove that there are about 15 or 17 of us that live in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, so they don't get back to Murray very often. Before I read this book, I had really taken the 19th Amendment for granted. I mean, gosh, I've been voting for 80 years, and I never thought about it until I read the book. And it was a mess. It was an issue. It took, 33 years to ratify it? And by the way, we weren't the last ones. Tennessee was. Now, I had to laugh at some of her books, some of her parts of the book. She quoted Henry Watterson, of which the Watterson Expressway was named, and he said, allowing women to vote would produce he-women, He/women. And some anti-suffragettes were fearful that intellectual pursuits for women might cause their reproduction organs to dry up, is that what it was, or to waver? To wander, yeah. Now, can you believe that? I can't imagine any woman at that time not wanting to vote and wanting to protest to vote. I wish I had asked my grandmother, B. Melugin, who's dead, of course. I never asked her about the 19th Amendment. I would love to know if she was for it, against it, or just neutral. I have a feeling she was probably for it, because I remember her handing out those little candidate cards that we used to all collect as children, and I think she was a Democrat. I'm not sure, but I think she was. I also wondered about some strong women that some of you might remember the names in Murray, and I wonder how they stood against or for the 19th Amendment. And some of those women come to mind. It's Miss Lois Waterfield, Miss Cappy Beal, and Gladys Scott. Now, I just have a feeling, I don't know if they marched or stayed home and cooked dinner or what they did, but I'd love to know how they felt about the 19th Amendment. So thank you, Dr. Goan, for coming, and for the History Department to serve as the venue. It's a good book. It really is. It's easily read, and it's not just for the stuffy old history teacher, you know. I hope I didn't offend you by saying that.
I hope I don't come off as a stuffy old history teacher. My name's Kathy Callahan. I'm the chair of the history department, and one of the greatest parts of my job is being able to recognize deserving students who are stellar in what they are doing. We have, I think, in the history department, been really lucky to have some of the strongest students at the institution work with us and then graduate and go on to do some really terrific things. We have 2 scholarship funds that we give scholarships out for every year. One is for undergrads, the other is for grad students, and then we also have a fund that gives faculty the opportunity for course release and perhaps travel to do research. And I'd like to talk about that one first. The Streeter family, Terry and Sarah, have enabled us to have a fund that allows at least one of our faculty members per year to have a course release to do research. And in this age of fewer dollars available to all of us in higher ed, this has been a particularly welcome opportunity for our faculty. And so thank you, Terry and Sarah, for your generosity. The first group of awards is for our undergraduate students. And one of our students was not able to come tonight, and so I'm going to let you know his name is Josh Roch. And Josh is at band practice right now, getting ready for Saturday's football game. But we have three undergrads who are here this evening who have received the T. Wayne Beasley Memorial Scholarship. This is named after T. Wayne Beasley, a professor of history at Murray State who died, I believe, in about 2008. A British historian who was very loved by the students that he worked with. And so this honors undergrads at Murray State in the history department. And so if the students would come forward, and then we're going to ask you after you collect your award to go over to the corner, and then Dr. Leonard is going to take your photo. We always have to have social media opportunities. So first of all, David Adams. Elise Eaton. And Entropy Kramer. Those awards are given at the end of their junior year for the use of their senior year. And again, we had 4 outstanding students today. I'd like to now recognize our graduate students. This award is for the late James Hammock, who worked at the history department for several years and served as department chairperson and was also on the Board of Regents. This award goes to our graduate students for outstanding scholarship. And this year we actually have 8 students who are receiving funds from that scholarship fund. And if I could ask the students to come forward and I read your name, then I will ask you to go over to the side too and have your photo taken. Annie Davis. Gage Overton. Maya Noonan. And is Brent Chow here tonight or Andrew Du Bois? I wasn't able to confirm whether they would come tonight, or J.C. Castellanos. All right, great. Well, thank you so much. Again, another round of applause for our student scholars.
There's a phone up here. Is that? That's mine. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. You know, I should also thank Carrie Jarrell also for sending out advertisements about this lecture and other things. I send a lot of stuff to her, and she always posts them on places that I don't know how to post them. She posts them. So I appreciate that. We're very honored tonight to have Dr. Melanie Beals Goan from the University of Kentucky. Dr. Goan is originally from Erie, Pennsylvania. She started at the University of Kentucky as a student in 1994. Before that, she earned a BA in history from Slippery Rock University, which is north of Pittsburgh. And as I said, she started at UK in 94, and she earned an MA and PhD from the University of Kentucky. Her research interest and teaching focus include 20th century U.S. history, Kentucky history, gender, and the history of healthcare. She has published 2 scholarly books. In 2008, the University of North Carolina Press published Mary Breckenridge, the Frontier Nursing Service and Rural Health in Appalachia. And that's one of the best publishing houses in the South. It's not easy to get a manuscript accepted at the UNC Press. And her second book was published by the University Press of Kentucky, and it is entitled A Simple Justice, Kentucky Women Fight for the Vote. And that is the topic of her talk tonight. So it has been delightful getting to know her this evening. I should also say that she's the head of the undergraduate program at the University of Kentucky, which is a big job, along with her teaching and also her scholarship. So we're very glad and honored to have her tonight, and let's welcome her to the podium.
Well, thank you, Dr. Humphreys. Thank you for the wonderful hospitality, and you said my name right. Usually people do not, so you get points right there for that. A couple of thank yous. I'd like to say thank you to the Easley family for sponsoring this lectureship. I think it's a wonderful tribute and way to remember, Sid, that you participate in the intellectual life of the community and allow us to delve into new topics maybe for some of you tonight. I'd also like to say a word. I know you all lost a dear colleague recently. Dr. Bolin was a great colleague as a historian of Kentucky. I valued his friendship and his work very highly, and so I do want to say something also in tribute to him. So, we've just passed a big milestone, and I'd forgive you if maybe you didn't notice in the chaos of COVID that we reached 100th anniversary for the 19th Amendment. Oh, it looks like we've timed out. Do you want to put that password back in there? Quarantine stopped a lot of the fun. We had all kinds of big things planned for this centennial milestone of the 19th Amendment. We'd been planning for about 5 years. We didn't get to do a lot of that, but a wave of new scholarship came out still in spite of quarantine. It didn't stop that. And I had a book that was part of that wave of scholarship. A new, fresh interpretation of women's suffrage. I always said that studying suffrage seemed a little too obvious. As a women's historian, I kind of thought, haven't we already done this? But we've realized we haven't fully done this even still. And so this new scholarship really providing fresh perspective. And my book, there's a picture once we get this up, but you maybe saw it on the table over there, kind of fun to see it out in the wild. Its big question is, what role did Kentucky women play in the fight for the vote? Why does Kentucky matter to this national story? We usually think of it on a national level. And I'm guessing if I asked you, Kentucky is not the first place you think of when you think of women's voting rights. Now, maybe you've put something in your mind when I pose that question. Whose minds automatically went to New York? Anyone think of New York? Seneca Falls, I'm guessing? Yeah, we think of New York. Maybe if you're really invested in this topic, there's the book there. Maybe if you really know something about women's suffrage, you might have thought of New Jersey, and I'll say something about that here in a second, or Wyoming, the first modern state to give women the right to vote in presidential elections. How many people thought Tennessee? And Mrs. Easley, you kind of led us in that direction. So Tennessee, the last state needed to be ratified. That's one we often think of. But Kentucky, who thinks of Kentucky when you think of women's suffrage? But Kentucky matters, and matters more than you might think. Hopefully that is going to become apparent tonight. So let me say something real quickly about the title I chose for this book, this Simple Justice. Picked it for a couple of reasons. One, very obviously, gets at the heart of the matter, right? Women's rights activists saw the vote as a simple justice. They were tired of being grouped with people who weren't trusted to have their voices count. They were influenced by the Enlightenment and revolutionary principles, America's promise of democracy. And they said it's a simple justice that we all have a role to play in this democracy. It was just the right thing to do. So the title reflects that. But there's another side to this title. It highlights some of the complications and the blind spots involved in the suffrage movement. And maybe there we'll add a little question mark. It's not actually on the book, but a question mark, a simple justice. Suffragists insisted the vote was a fundamental right, even as they hesitated to grant it to all women. Race and gender intersect here in important ways, makes suffrage anything but simple. We're going to see that tonight, too. If you've ever wondered, why did it take so long for women to get the right to vote? 7 decades. Well, if it had been so simple, we probably would have accomplished it a lot sooner. So now this word suffrage, let me say something about that. The word doesn't have anything to do with suffering, although women did plenty of that to gain the right to vote. It means simply the right to participate in political elections. When we think of the vote, our minds naturally turn to the 19th Amendment, and that's what we've just gotten done celebrating. Its final ratification, August 26, 1920. It was a big deal. Of course it was. We picture it as a joyful day, women waving flags and celebrating. These suffragists who had worked so hard for so many years now finally accomplishing their goal. We see it as an endpoint. 1920, women got the right to vote. I hear people say it a lot. We think it was a finale, like a switch had gotten flipped on that one day. We celebrate Women's Equality Day every year in honor of this magic day, the one shining moment when women became voters. But this idea, unfortunately, a little misguided. For one thing, millions of women were voting long before 1920. And I'll put this map up here and you can kind of study it. This was a map that suffragists used a lot. They would update it each year. Every time there was a suffrage victory, they'd get out their colored pencils. I can imagine them shading and coloring things. So a lot of women voting before 1920, and in a lot of cases, their grandmothers had been voting before 1920. If you look there, the states that are white, those are states where women had full suffrage. They could vote in any election. Women in 15 states were so equipped by the time the 19th Amendment came around. I said something about New Jersey women. Although you can't tell it there, New Jersey women were some of the very first to vote. From 1790 to 1807, they could vote in presidential elections. And then got yanked away. They were voting too often, and some people thought for the wrong people. Rights that were won didn't always stick. They could be revoked. So this map constantly changing. Maybe when we were talking about places we associate with suffrage, maybe you thought of Western states. A lot of these states where women had full voting rights by 1920 were in the West. It explains why, and students are always puzzled by this. They talk about World War I, Jeanette Rankin voting against U.S. entrance into the war, and they're like, wait a minute, this is 1917, women can't even vote. Well, she's serving in the U.S. House of Representatives because Montana women already had the vote. Suffragists imagined almost like this woman carrying the torch that suffrage rights were going to spread across the nation, and they were really moving largely west to east. Now, this map, if you were really noticing its fine detail there, you can see categories of suffrage. In some cases, women have full suffrage. In some cases, they have limited suffrage. So in particular contexts, maybe they can vote. Now, I'll ask you to take note there of Kentucky and look at how it's shading, what that reveals. So many women voting before 1920, and the reality was not all women are going to vote after 1920. Especially African American women in southern states. Black men had been denied the vote, black women right alongside them. You can see the number by 1940, the number of African Americans who are registered to vote. But also Asian women, immigrant women, Native American women, even some native-born women who married foreign men lost the right to vote for a time after 1920. It would take further legislation. 1965, we point to that, kind of a second chapter, the Voting Rights Act, finally allowing many women to vote for the first time. So we should celebrate the 19th Amendment, but we have to be mindful of its limitations. Our memory, when we're thinking about the suffrage movement, is that women were marching lockstep in pursuit of their goal. But when we look at this movement up close, we see that actually there's a whole lot of disagreement. For one thing, a lot of women were not in favor of the vote. They were active anti-suffragists. So you have that split. There was disagreement on tactics, priorities. What do we do first? The methods, they disagreed. Disagreement on how radical they should be. And let me say something about terminology here. We tend to use these words interchangeably, suffragists, suffragettes. Kentucky women did not want to be considered white Kentucky conservative suffragists were very precise in that terminology. Suffragettes were their British counterparts who were breaking windows and engaging in criminal acts. That was not what Kentucky suffragists saw themselves as all about. So disagreement there. Disagreement in, like I said, who should be included. Exclusion based on race, literacy will become another qualification for the vote. And I would say we shouldn't be surprised that very bold, enterprising women didn't always agree. I mean, this almost seems pretty obvious. But value at looking beneath the surface to understand some of the messiness that went on. There's value in pushing ourselves to look at suffrage in new contexts. Understanding it on a state and local level lets us get down in the trenches with women. The fight somehow feels more relevant. I always think when we can make a Kentucky connection, we become more interested. So Kentucky has its own suffrage story, and it's a really important one. Did you know that Kentucky women, after New Jersey, we were some of the very first to vote in the nation. Now, it's not all Kentucky women, and it's only in some limited contexts. Only in some rural areas, widows, tax-paying women could vote in school elections, get this, as early as 1838. 1838, yeah. Pretty impressive. I'm pretty proud of that. And suffrage leaders, national suffrage leaders, noticed it as well. One women's rights leader praised Kentucky for being one little point of light, offering hope for all Americans. Now, this milestone, 1838, that's really before there's a viable suffrage movement in the country. If you know anything about women's rights, it develops as an offshoot of abolition. Women start to look around, they're fighting for other people's rights. What about us, our own rights? It remains a small movement for a long time. A really radical cockamamie plan, and I like that word, cockamamie. Few people, it seemed, could get behind it. Associated with emancipation, that was radical enough, but also things like free love and socialism, goodness gracious. Movement doesn't really gain steam until the Civil War. After the Civil War, you get the Reconstruction Amendments really pointing us to look at voting rights. And national leaders at that point make it a priority to create a nationwide movement. And that's going to need to include the South. And that's where Kentucky coming in as well. Because you remember, they gave women the school suffrage very early on. And national leaders look, as they're thinking about expansion, and Kentucky seems like an obvious place. Kentucky, the key to the South. And so they start to really hit Kentucky hard. Susan B. Anthony makes a visit. Kentucky women starting to get interested. Kentucky, another reason it seems like such promising ground is it has a contingent of really useful leaders, women with a lot of leadership potential, and in one family in particular. And you see the Clay name up there. You know the Clay name. If you're from Kentucky, I assume you know the Clay name. You may know Henry Clay. This is not Henry Clay's line here. This is a cousin of Henry Clay. Actually, I'm going to put him up here for a second, then we're going to get rid of him because I don't want to put the spotlight on him. Cassius Clay, Henry Clay's cousin, you might say he does more for Kentucky women's suffrage than any other man in the state, though not for the right reasons. Because if you know anything about Cassius Clay, he treats the women in his family really, really badly. He leaves his wife, Mary Jane Warfield Clay, to run a big household. During the Civil War, he's off in Russia serving as ambassador. He comes home, but instead of thanking her for her dedication, he brings home an illegitimate love child with him from Russia, divorces his wife, treats her really badly. And this lights a fire not only under her, but her daughters as well. And there are 4, as they were known at the time, Clay girls, the sisters, and they all become really interested in suffrage and women's rights generally, because the law had preferenced Cassius Clay's rights over those of his wife and daughters. And so we'll put Laura Clay up there and replace Cassius with her. I bet if you know any Kentucky suffragists, Laura Clay is the name you probably know. She's actually not the first of the sisters. Mary Barr Clay, her older sister, is a lot more active early on. But Laura's going to be the one that becomes synonymous with Kentucky suffrage. Part of this is because she never married, and she makes suffrage work her life mission. It becomes a career for her. She plays a key role in creating a state suffrage organization. They call themselves the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. It's the first of its kind in the South. Another way, Kentucky leading. Established 1888. Laura Clay is going to run it for 25 years. She'll be the president. Now, even though women's rights was tied and considered radical for the time, Laura Clay is going to help steer CARA to be a pretty conservative organization. She knew this was going to be controversial in a state like Kentucky. We were the Bible Belt. She wants it to be a mainstream issue. So she works very hard to reassure people who might see it as unladylike and maybe a little unseemly. So some of the things she does, for instance, CARA meetings always start with a prayer. They sing hymns, religion infused into everything they did. Early meetings were in women's parlors, probably with some of the curtains even pulled. They focused on reforms other than the vote at first. The vote, that was a little too outlandish, but there were other things, other changes that women wanted to see. So, for instance, petitioning the legislature for a Women's Property Act. Women didn't have the right to control what they owned. It belonged to their husbands. So changing that. Age of consent laws, which at the time, girls aged 12 were old enough to consent. They wanted to open colleges to women. They wanted to add matrons to prisons, female guards. So these kind of changes at first. Only over time do they shift to focus on the vote. And most Kentucky suffragists shared Clay's priorities. The group tended to be very homogeneous. They were middle and upper class women, Christian women for the most part, overtly Christian. Well-educated, they tended to live in a few places in the state. Lexington, Richmond had a very active suffrage organization, Northern Kentucky. Those were the places where it takes off earliest. Laura Clay, pretty conventional. Organizing, let me say, Western Kentucky, organizing doesn't take off until later, the 19-teens, really, before you see a lot of activity in this part of the state. Now, it doesn't mean everyone agreed with Laura Clay, and there are going to be other influences in the state, so I'll introduce you to a couple of them. Other women that are not as well remembered. If you don't know Josephine Henry's name, you really should. In CARA's earliest years, it's Clay and Henry who are working side by side in this movement. Her specialty, Josephine, she was really good at legislative affairs. Every time the legislature's in session, she's there. She's lobbying lawmakers for changes that she saw as important. The women's property bill was her biggest priority. She liked to tell shocking stories of women and what they had lost because the law favored men. Women in her own community who had been stripped of their assets. For instance, this man, this woman had bought a cow with money she had earned. She had sewed, saved it up, bought a cow. And her husband sold the cow right out from under her. The only concession, as Josephine Henry explained, that the woman got was they let her milk the cow as they were leading it away. Worse, Henry said, the greedy husband filled up with whiskey and started on the warpath. This scoundrel. So she's bold, she is calling a spade, and not nearly as wedded to convention as Laura Clay. She's the first woman in Kentucky to run for statewide office. She went for the clerk of Kentucky's Court of Appeals, 1890, and when someone said, "Why'd you run for that office?" she said, "Well, it paid the best. That's the one I went for." Later, she's mentioned as a candidate for U.S. president in 1900. She ran under the Prohibition Party ticket. She loved to push the envelope. She's very provocative. Cranky is how some people described her. If you know anything about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she worked on this project, The Woman's Bible, which was really controversial. Josephine Henry is helping in that project. She declares herself an atheist. She even argued Thanksgiving should be abolished. She had a lot of out there ideas. And Laura Clay does not see this as good for Kentucky's movement. This is not good to try and make suffrage more palatable to more people. So Clay pushes her out of the movement. Her ouster puts Cara on a much more conservative path. There are other women, too, don't see eye to eye with Clay. One would be Mary Britton, that you see here. Britton gave one of the very first known suffrage speeches in Kentucky. 1887, she speaks to a convention of black teachers, and she gives a very detailed argument for why women should get the right to vote. It was later published, so we have it word for word. Britton had gone to Berea College. She becomes a teacher, then later she becomes a medical doctor, a dedicated race woman. Britton believes in women's suffrage, but she's never going to belong to Cara. She and Clay don't cross paths. She doesn't join Cara because it's never an option for her. Cara will be a white organization. It will remain segregated throughout its history. Now, black women are suffragists, and they're going to vote whenever they have the chance, but they're not going to join Cara. It's a little ironic because Clay comes from an emancipationist family, but you wouldn't know it the way she addresses race. Clay makes a name for herself in Kentucky, keeps a tight grip on activities here, and she's also nationally influential. President of Cara, also an officer in the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And you can see here, she is hobnobbing with famous suffragists that you've probably heard of. This is a page from her scrapbook. It's in UK Special Collections. And you can see here this nice candid image. Laura Clay's in the back row. And in front there, it maybe you recognize Susan B. Anthony standing there, Aunt Susan, as other suffragists called her. So Laura Clay, she is right there in the mix of the most influential suffrage forces. She travels all over the country. She goes states as they're trying to pass state suffrage amendments. She's there to assist them in their efforts. So another way Kentucky matters to the national story. The suffrage movement starts out with really lofty goals of universal suffrage. Everyone should have the vote. That's what suffragists early on are saying, but they back away from that as time goes on. And one reason for that is Laura Clay and her influence and her arguments that we have to tread lightly on the issue of race to help get the South on board. Now, I put that photo up there to show black women, they want the vote, and whenever possible, they're going to go out there and use that. So a picture there from 1920 of women registering here in Kentucky to vote. But most white members of Cara seem perfectly content that the organization has a policy of racial exclusion. In its records, you can find these really virulent calls for white supremacy, and they're using those words exactly. These are even more shocking when you think these are people who want to expand democracy, but only to certain people. Every now and then, though, there were calls for racial unity. One of these moments came in the 1890s. I said something about school suffrage. Some women in Kentucky have that in 1838. Others are going to get it over time. We add other parts of the state. Kentucky divided cities into classes of cities. So in 1894, in Kentucky's second-class cities, Lexington, Covington, Newport, those women get the school suffrage. And suffragists jump into action. They want to prove that women desired to vote, that they would turn out to use this new right. And they even cross racial lines and they go into black neighborhoods to try and encourage black women to vote. And it worked. Black women show up. They show up in large numbers, in larger numbers in some places than the white women show up, which you can imagine posed a problem. And it caused the Kentucky Legislature a few years later to revoke the right. They take it back again. And Dwayne Bolin, some of his work I relied on because he looks at that rescission that happens. So women watched the rights that they had worked for evaporate and then spend a long time trying just to regain the ground that they had lost. So this issue of race hits home for a lot of white Kentucky suffragists. They saw what it meant when black women voted. In that case, they thought that had become a problem. But even suffragists who were more egalitarian, more progressive, still saw the race issue as complicating matters in ways that were dangerous. It was just waters they didn't think they should wade into. This is Madeleine McDowell Breckenridge. Now, everyone always thought Laura Clay was Henry Clay's granddaughter. She wasn't. This was actually the great-granddaughter of Henry Clay. She becomes president in 1912 of CARA. She's Clay's handpicked successor. She is forward-thinking. She's the consummate progressive-era reformer. She's even known to support racial equality, but CARA, even under her watch, stays all white. She discourages black women from getting involved. In fact, she says, hey, once we get the right to vote, then you can use it too. But for now, let's try and keep this focused on white women. Madeleine McDowell Breckenridge going to change the movement. Laura Clay, I said, had been pretty conventional. She didn't like parades, anything that was unseemly. Madeleine McDowell Breckenridge, she wants to use every gimmick possible. So parades, great, let's do it. Take a stamp and stamp your letters, votes for women, anything that can get our message out there. And CARA gonna grow considerably under her watch. You can see how here, or maybe you can, the first, I think it starts in about 1900, and CARA only has about 300 members. For much of its history, Madeleine McDowell Breckenridge becomes president in the 19-teens, and the numbers begin to shoot way up. Probably part of it's because of her progressive ideas and also the new methods she's introducing. So Kentucky has important national leaders, its victories, its setbacks. All of these things make it important in the story of U.S. women's suffrage. But it's also important for one other very simple reason. We ratified the 19th Amendment here, one of only 4 southern states to do so. If any one of the states, the 36 that chose to ratify, hadn't, who knows how long it would have taken for women to get the vote. So as I conclude, I want us to look at this photo here for a minute, an iconic image taken at the ratification signing. Governor Morrow, Edward Morrow there in the center of the shot. And I love this picture for a number of reasons. You can see they're wearing their sashes proudly, the sense of pride. If you look around the technology of the day, you can see power electrical cords running from the ceiling. There's some fans in the background. So it's indicative of its times. But the people here, important to notice who's included there and who's not included. So Governor Morrow signing. Behind him, looks like she's kind of breathing down his neck there. That's his wife, Kate Morrow. make sure you sign that amendment. Madeleine McDowell Breckenridge is in the picture there, very proudly watching. This is largely her achievement, guiding Kentucky to ratify. She's going to only vote one time, and this is a bit of a spoiler, but Madeleine McDowell Breckenridge, she votes that November, and she suffered from tuberculosis. She actually had a stroke and died just 2 weeks after she cast her one vote for president. Other women here, I'll point out, there's a Western Kentucky woman kind of peeking behind there, Josephine Fowler Post. She's from Paducah. A lot of these women are from Louisville in the shot. You notice they're white, most of them middle-aged, fairly affluent, a lot of club women included. But the photo is really important for who's not in there. A glaring absence, and I don't think maybe you could recognize her in that sea of women. A bunch of us really carefully tried to identify all the women. I know Laura Clay's not in there. No Laura Clay. And you might say, well, is she still alive? Maybe she's dead by that point. She's not. She's not at the ratification, even though we would expect her to be there. She'd given her whole life to this cause, but she is not in this picture because she didn't support the 19th Amendment. As an author, this was a great plot twist. I start the book with her going to Tennessee, not to help shepherd the 19th Amendment through, but to fight tooth and nail to keep it from being ratified. In June 1919, Congress passes the amendment, sends it to the states for ratification. Laura Clay is incensed. She's bewildered. She doesn't know what to do. Well, she knows what to do. She immediately resigns from all of her suffrage activities. She resigns from the Kentucky organization, from the national. She goes as a states' rights suffrage to do everything she can to defeat the amendment. This is in Nashville as the legislature's battling it out. There was anti-ratification headquarters. Laura Clay's there. She pins the rows of the anti-ratificationists on her chest and says, "What can I do?" You might notice this picture. There's a Confederate flag in the backdrop there. These anti-ratificationists don't want the 19th Amendment to pass because, in their minds, it would reopen the wounds of the 15th Amendment. It would interfere with states' abilities to control their own electorate. And you can see here the kind of rhetoric that anti-suffragists are offering. And Laura Clay is helping to pass out these flyers. Shocking turn of events. Yeah. Now, let me say, Clay wanted to vote. That's not the question. She believes men and women are equal in the eyes of God. America should live up to its democratic ideals, all that stuff. She thought she was as smart as any man she knows. She should vote. It's not about the goal. It's all about the method. Under no circumstance does she want to vote if it comes from a federal amendment. And you may read the federal amendment and say, okay, what's so threatening about that? Laura Clay has some other reasons. It's largely race, but I will say there are some other reasons as well. I can talk about more in the Q&A, or you could read the book. I go into lots of detail there. Couple takeaway lessons as we're thinking of this. Anniversary of the 19th Amendment has encouraged us to really be thoughtful about voting, and it's a good time to be thoughtful about voting right now. Thinking about voting past and present in the country. When we look at the 19th Amendment, it offers some really good civics lessons. It reminds us that the vote is not guaranteed. We think in a democracy like the United States, of course, voting is a fundamental right. Of course, our Constitution addresses this, but it does not. The U.S. Constitution does not guarantee anyone the right to vote, nor does the Bill of Rights. States have authority over electoral qualifications, even in national elections. The fight for the 19th Amendment reminds us that voting rights have been won in a piecemeal fashion, hard fought, sometimes gained but also taken away. States control who votes, but the federal government has come back and kind of offered some backdoor protections. It's always come through constitutional amendments. Hasn't said who can vote, but says who can't be denied. So based on factors like race, the 15th Amendment addresses voting rights. The 19th Amendment, sex, age addressed in the 26th Amendment, but always framed negatively, stipulating what states cannot do, not what they must do. We think of the 19th Amendment as giving all women the right to vote, but that isn't the case, as we saw also. A third and very important lesson, rights won can be taken away. We have to be vigilant. We have to be vigilant today in 2022. Gerrymandering, felon exclusion. You hear the news, you know these things. Vote by mail restrictions, limiting polling hours, efforts to clean up the voting rolls. All of these things still threatening to silence some American voters today. And now more possible than ever to deny rights since Shelby versus Holder removed important protections. This week we just celebrated National Voter Registration Day, so I imagine I'm speaking to the choir here. Make sure you're registered, make sure the people around you are registered, and make sure you're paying attention. We owe it to all these women, everyone through U.S. history who has fought so hard to expand voting rights. We don't want to see them disappear under our watch. Okay, thank you. I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
When segregationists in the South often opposed voting rights, it was always along the lines that if the blacks get the right to vote, they'll take over. Do we hear some of that same rhetoric with women too?
Yeah, and very interestingly, that's definitely something they're considering, is how will this skew who has a voice? And so their argument is it's going to make it less democratic because now you're going to have these new voters who take over, like you said. One thing that's really interesting, though, an argument that is being made often in the South when they're thinking about women's voting rights, and women suffragists are really hitting this drumbeat hard, that white women enfranchised are going to offset the black men. And, of course, the South finds ways to disfranchise black men on their own, but there's a moment in the South where southern states, Mississippi, for instance, is considering giving women the right to vote. And you look and you say, oh, well, how progressive of them. But it's not anything to do with that. They are calculating down to, like, the number. This is the number of women, white women in the South. This is the number of black men in the South. This is the mathematics to show if white women get the right to vote, they're going to snow in was the term they always seem to use, snow in the black vote. Yeah, so that's definitely part of the consideration.
Can you talk about the woman triumphant statue?
Oh, yes, in Lexington, which doesn't exist. You can't come to Lexington to look at it. Some women in Lexington, largely because there was a male politician, U.S. congressman from Kentucky, W.C. Breckenridge, who found himself in an indiscretion with a very young woman, and women were outraged. And W.C.P. Breckenridge becomes kind of a stand-in for all the men in their lives who have treated them wrong. You know, all these philandering men, they're going to get back at them. So they work really hard to push W.C.P. Breckenridge out. And in the process, they kind of organize amongst themselves, and they begin to push for a statue in Lexington that stood in the courthouse. And it's a little scandalous because it's a naked woman. But a woman triumphant, and she's posed with Cupid, and he's trying to shoot his arrows, and she's kind of lording over him. And so it's a real feminist, pro-feminist message. Problem was, it got destroyed when the courthouse burned, and a big bell, I think it was, fell on it and smashed it. So we don't have any remnants of it, but the women saying, public art, we're going to send a message to the men in our lives. Yes?
Is there an interesting story behind Governor Morrow?
Governor Morrow, well, he's a Republican. That makes him a little interesting in the state of Kentucky. Well, let me think what I can share about him. He's fairly racially progressive for the time, and it very much is in favor of women voting. He was a good family friend of Madeleine Mcdowell Breckenridge, so she kind of had an in with him. And he comes out really strong, gives an address to the legislature at the beginning of the session, which I believe was one of the first times the governor had ever done that. And he speaks very favorably of women's suffrage. And so the legislature is behind this. First day of the session, passes it in almost record time. And so Governor Morrow kind of setting the tone for that passage. And Laura Clay was trying to prevent that too. She was heartbroken when Kentucky ratified, so she was working against it. Yes? Yes.
Did she play a role in him being pro-women voting at all, or did he develop that separately and then meet her?
No. Well, she had been involved in suffrage organizing for several years. She's one of these that kind of comes online during the 19-teens as it becomes this more mainstream cause. And so she was active. I'm sure she's having a lot of influence over her husband as well. But she fully supported this. She knew all the women in that picture because she had been active in the movement too.
Can you give an explanation or reasoning your mind why the vote was moving from west to east? I suppose because culture, I thought in that time was always sort of moving west.
Yeah, it is a little surprising, isn't it? Well, in areas where government is forming, all the territories that are becoming states, you had women playing a pretty important role in a lot of these western states. The one that a lot of people have focused on is Utah. And Utah women get the vote very early, and some have argued that polygamy has a lot to do with it, and defending polygamy, as a matter of fact. And so people that study suffrage in the West will often really stress that it's not always that they're so enlightened in these areas, but there's often an ulterior motive. And going back to New Jersey, when women get the vote, it's for partisan reasons. It gets yanked away for partisan reasons. It's often beyond the women themselves, the impetus for that. And so in the West, you have certain cases on a state-by-state basis. You can kind of look and see, okay, what were the issues of the day? And often that's factoring into women getting the vote. But the trend had been, there's much more support for women's suffrage in the West than the East. Yeah, New York was kind of the turning point when New York in 1917 gives women the right to vote. It was like, okay, finally we're going to start to see some progress in the East. Uh-huh.
Was there any particular geographic or partisan pattern in the voting in the state legislature on the 19th Amendment?
Here in Kentucky?
Yes.
You had, well, both parties were trying to show that they were pro-women at the last minute. I'm trying to remember the breakdown now. The House passed it really quickly, and it got kind of tied up for a matter of hours in the Senate. But really, by the time we get to the first day of the session, it was a foregone conclusion that it was going to pass. And both parties, even though they had for years stood in the way of the vote, now made it seem like, oh, we're the biggest friend of women voters that has ever been. And, they're bending over backwards. Once women are enfranchised, they want to make sure that women are a friend to them as well. But the Democratic Party, with race playing such an important role in party politics in Kentucky, and the Republican Party having a lot of African American support, Democrats jump into action when women get the vote, and they're trying to ensure that white women are going to turn out to protect the race. I mean, they're saying it in those kind of blatant terms, but they're afraid that white women Democrats, there's plenty of them, the majority are women, or are Democrats, but if they don't show up at the polls, that could be a real problem for the Democratic Party. So race continues after the amendment passes, after Kentucky women are sure of voting in the presidential election that fall. Race continues to be a really important issue in that election.
What happened to the 10 states that did not ratify?
Women still became voters.
I mean, they had to.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to remember exactly where it is. There are states that continue to try to block that. And what we see, Kentucky's interesting in another way. After the 19th Amendment is ratified and women vote in 1920, everyone's looking to see, okay, will they really vote? And in a lot of states, they do not vote in large numbers at all. In Kentucky, we're different. I think it was 56% of women across the state voted, and that included a lot of black women. And that made Kentucky very, very unusual, because what we see throughout the South is if black men had been disfranchised, then black women were not likely to vote either. Kentucky is an anomaly that way.
What about California? Did they not let them vote, or did they?
Well, California had given women state suffrage. I think California is like 1910, 1911, somewhere in there. And so California women have been voting in presidential elections prior to 1920. I'm trying to think of some of the ones, I think Alabama, Mississippi, they continue to fight to try and invalidate the 19th Amendment, but once an amendment's added to the Constitution legally, women should have had the right to vote unless they're excluded through other means, which was the case. I think, yeah.
I was curious, I've recently spent a little time studying the Daughters of the Confederacy in the state and had kind of realized there's a leaning in the suffragist movement. Do you know if
Yeah, she is definitely hooked up with Daughters of the Confederacy. She's also very active in the WCTU. She was involved in multiple organizations, but a lot of her friends are also Daughters of the Confederacy too, as well. And some of that virulent racism I'm talking about, some of the letters I'm thinking of were Daughters of the Confederacy, had ties to that. Yeah.
Can you speak more about Laura Clay and those other reasons besides the states' rights ideology?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, so race is very squarely in her thinking on the 19th Amendment, but it went beyond that, I think. She had really made a name for herself as a Southern suffragist. Some of her closest friends were, like, for instance, Kate Gordon from Louisiana. And some of her influence nationally had begun to wane, but among Southern suffragists, she is the hero. And so as we get closer to the 19th Amendment, and they are definitely against a federal amendment, she had been kind of wishy-washy on it. I think she thought it would never happen, first of all, and she never thought they'd get enough states to ratify it. When it becomes a reality, though, then it really hits her hard. And I think part of it is she's thinking about her own identity. And you imagine this woman, she's in her 60s by then. She's given her whole life to this cause. I mean, her name's in the newspaper all the time. She's got a degree of fame for her role. And now it's about to come to an end. It's all going to end. And once the vote is won, that's it. And I think there's some part of her that would like to see the fight continue. She's willing to wait on a state amendment. She says, even if it takes a decade, well, we'll keep fighting. Well, she over and over says, I don't want some man far away to give me the right to vote. I want Kentucky men to trust me with this right. And so she couches it that way, but I think it's a lot about her loss of her identity that she fears. But, I mean, I can't imagine. She's in Tennessee, and all her friends are there trying to get the 19th Amendment ratified. And they're passing in the halls, and they're just acting like they don't see her. She acts like she doesn't see them. So uncomfortable. Yeah.
Is Laura Clay's hesitancy for the national amendment tied to the big question of states' rights and how that ties into the Daughters of the Confederacy? That organization has always been very much about the state should make these decisions, and so do you think that's where her twist comes, perhaps?
Yeah, but again, early on, she doesn't seem to be too worried about an amendment. She's kind of like, well, the vote will come as the vote comes. I just want to vote. By about 1911, 1913, she's definitely changing her tune. And you can see her racism coming out by that point. And racism across the United States, as we move into the 20th century, segregation taking root, the violence of the era. And, she's talking about if black men, if they vote, they are going to, have power over white women, and this is reprehensible. She just becomes more pronounced in her racism. And I think, states' rights, as it often was more of a crutch than anything, right? A way to legitimize their racism, pure and simple, but to couch it in something that seemed a little more pure, Yeah. Yeah.
she okay with women losing their citizenship and marry foreigners?
I don't know, I don't remember her ever seeing her views on that afterwards.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Mackenzie versus Hare and women losing the vote and their citizenship. Yeah, like if you married a foreign man, your citizenship, followed his. And so, it's just a short amount of time, like 2 or 3 years, that becomes an issue, and then that gets fixed for women. But I don't remember her specifically ever addressing that. Yeah, right. Other questions? Yeah.
Were the dry counties, so the legislators in the dry counties more likely to vote for the 19th Amendment than ones in the wet areas?
Yeah, alcohol plays an important role in your position on it. If you were a wet, you were afraid of women voters because they were gonna have their way, and their way had always been to get rid of alcohol. And so lawmakers who are from wet areas and share those views tend to be, but not always in an overt way. And that was Madeleine Mcdowell Breckenridge. She was really frustrated about this and felt like they were always working behind the scenes to sink any kind of suffrage legislation and a state amendment. She didn't think it would ever happen because the third legislature in the state, the Wets, were going to stop it from happening. Uh-huh.
Well, first, if anybody needs to register to vote, I have some voter registration cards.
Oh, great, yes.
But thank you so much, this is really interesting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the school board, how the women were able to vote in school boards, what would that look like?
Yeah.
How active were they?
Yeah. So what's really interesting to me is 1838. Like I said, it was only in certain parts of the state because some communities had already created public school systems, but this was part of act to create school districts in some of these unorganized places. And I thought, well, what did women do? They must have somehow convinced male lawmakers to put this in. It doesn't appear to be the case. It almost seems like it just slipped in. I think it was less about gender and more about property rights. And as a taxpayer, they were concerned that you should have influence. If you were paying school taxes, then you should have a voice in those matters. Now, the other thing, women, schools, children, you think about their natural sphere of influence. Schools fit into that, their teachers, their parents. And so across the country, school suffrage becomes an entering wedge. If you can get the vote in this one area that feels a little more natural, feels less controversial, then women can prove themselves, they can go on, and it'll expand from there. Some suffragists believe that. Some others said, no, that just dilutes our efforts. We got to go for it all or nothing. But school suffrage becomes more popular across the country by the 20th century. Other states have surpassed us by then because, like I said, Kentucky takes away the right for about a decade. Between 1901 and 1912, women lose the right to vote in those school elections.
Randy Patterson gave me this. Lucille Grogan was elected superintendent.
Yes, I looked that up today. Yes, 1913, Callaway County. I think there were about 30 female school superintendents elected that year. So she was one of a whole group. Yeah, yeah.
She was first elected in 1908.
Oh, okay, in 1908, and re-elected
She
in,
defeated an incumbent, a male incumbent, who went on to become quite a politician and leader in Callaway County for decades.
yeah. But not in the schools, he moved,
No, not
then
in the schools.
he'd gotten defeated.
The cycle after she defeated him, he ran for county judge
Oh,
and was elected.
so he bounced back, but, yeah. Yeah, you know, female superintendents we see across the state, a large number, starting in the 1880s. So there again, you know, women aren't voting, but they're holding a particular kind of office in a lot of places.
Or Lucille Grogan, if she didn't have the right to.
I'm trying to think, okay, by that point, so if 1912 is when school suffrage was restored. So women, I'm fairly certain, would have been voting here in that election. Now, whether they turned out or not. Because the 1838, we don't have a lot of evidence that women used that right. It was on the books, but it's not clear whether they're actually showing up to vote or not. Yeah, here in Callaway County, I looked it up because I thought someone might ask. They don't get a suffrage local, they called them locals, here until 1914. There was a speaker that came through and did a sweep of Western Kentucky. Western Kentucky had been really hard. A lot of women were involved in the WCTU. They weren't real interested in suffrage. I mean, they're also working hard and running farms and families, and they got more important stuff to do. But you have a suffrage local that does form here in 1914. Yeah, that was the million-dollar question. Everyone wanted to know, like, how was this a reform that had an impact? And what we see is in a lot of places, women do not turn out in equal numbers to men till the 1980s. So and like I said, Kentucky always had really high voter turnout among males. Women turn out in large numbers, but that's not the case throughout the country. And of course, things like office holding, we still haven't caught up women. We're still working for an equal seat at the table. But there were examples, though, of things in the 20s that new women voters, I think it was more that men were afraid of what they could do with the vote. So like Shepard-Towner Act to fund maternal health care, that's always held up as a product of women's suffrage. It then was, it only lasted, though, for a few years. It's almost like male politicians realized, oh, the women aren't going to punish us if we don't support their programs, and then it sunsetted pretty quickly. Yeah.
Would you account for the increase in women voting in the 80s based upon the candidacy of Martha Collins, or the next year when Geraldine Ferraro is on the ticket with Walter Mondale? Would those be contributing factors?
Yeah, you know, that's a good question. I'm not sure I can speak to that, but certainly women are more visible in American politics by that point. You know, I think I've heard it associated with the soccer mom phenomenon and kind of the 1980s, just changing gender roles in general, but it could be who's on the ballot too is a little more attractive to them too. Anything else? Wow, you all asked some really great questions. I appreciate it. This has been really fun. Thank you all. and I'll stick around here